Hello, welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thile. We continue on in our Torah study this week, the book of Exodus. We have three chapters, chapter 21 to 24. Although we won't finish the whole chapter there, we just go to verse 18. Then we have Jeremiah chapter 33 and 34, a few passages out of those two chapters. And then we close with Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42, and chapter 17, verses 1 through 11. We'll look at all these passages together. We'll spend more time focusing on the Torah, which is the writings of Moses, the teachings of Moses. So that would be the Exodus passages. You spend more time there. Look at how the prophets balance out with those passages where you have a time before the entering into the land and the covenant, all that kind of stuff, and the laws and the ordinances and just the stories and the history. Then you have the prophet portions go and look at a time where they've now been living in the land and they've usually in some way failed to keep up their end of their covenant with God, and then look at promises for the future. And then we always look at passages from the New Testament to see perspective from the vantage point of Yeshua being the Messiah, and the idea that the Messiah came a first time and will come a second time, and how all of these passages may relate to each other. So Exodus chapter 21, an extremely difficult portion to read. And you start reading these types of narratives where you're having these laws listed for you. And you could definitely feel like, I know I would feel this way. I usually feel this way anyway when I read the Old Testament. I don't know if it's just ingrained in me because being a New Testament believer, a believer in Jesus, there wasn't always a lot of emphasis on the Old Testament. There was always the telling of the stories. I could tell you the stories of, going through the Red Sea, which was a sea of reeds actually, but I could tell you those stories. I could tell you the story of the 10 plagues. I could tell you the stories of Elijah and Mount Carmel and all that kind of stuff. I knew those stories, but get into the nitty gritty of it, it can be a bit much. You definitely ask yourself, at least this is how I relate to it, so I don't know if you feel the same, let me know in the comments below, but I definitely feel like, why am I reading this? Why am I studying it? Why am I spending my time looking at these old laws and covenants and so on and so forth? But again, the point of this study is to do that, and then to get a fuller picture of Messiah and Yeshua, and then the faith that he was authoring in light of the previous covenants. It's really important. It's really important to know the previous covenants and the context of those covenants and everything that was going on at those times, to then see where Yeshua was taking the faith and where he was defining and authoring his own faith. And it's important to know that, because if you want to have an authentic faith, one that reflects the faith of God, or the faith that God has for us to believe, then we have to know the faith that Yeshua authored and perfected. I struggle a lot with current versions of Christian faith that's out there, because a lot of those versions of the faith have been turned and twisted in different ways for different purposes and different reasons. Not going to get into all those things right now, but it definitely has an impact on my belief, on your belief, in such a way where there's plenty of people today who are out there talking about deconstruction. They're deconstructing their faith. They're breaking it down to the core parts and trying to build it back up again. And if you're someone who's into deconstruction, this podcast is for you, because we are also deconstructing the faith, but I'm doing it in a way we're holding up the teachings of old, the teachings of Moses, the Torah, and all the scriptures. And then we're looking at those scriptures in light of what Yeshua taught and his disciples taught and what Paul wrote. And so trying to construct a faith out of what is there already for us to study and learn, not kind of deconstructing and building up a faith that makes me feel better about myself. That's definitely a challenge that's out there for those who are in the process of deconstructing their faiths. It's not falling into the temptation of creating a faith then that works for you, works best for you. That's not what we want when we're deconstructing a faith. What we want when we're deconstructing a faith and we're rebuilding it is we want to be authentic and real, and we want to build it up in the way it was supposed to be built for us. And so that's really the goal of going through all these passages and taking a look at them in detail. So, with all that said, let's get to the passage. You can see that it's called Ordinances for the Covenant. That's what the title of this week's reading translates to, is ordinances. Ordinances or laws or guidelines on how to live, how to, just conduct life within a community that is now, just experiencing life in a new way where they're not slaves anymore. They've escaped from Egypt. They've been delivered. They've traveled through the wilderness. They're now getting ready to make the next part of their journey onto the promised land that God is going to be giving to them. And so they need to learn how to live with each other and amongst each other in a very practical way, not just between us, me and God, but also between neighbor to neighbor. And what's interesting is this section is one of the oldest sections of laws in the Bible. It's obviously the first one that we're coming across. It is the very first one. It's also the oldest. And you look at Exodus chapter 24, you see, so that's towards the end of this reading, it says that Moses goes to the people, so he gets these words from Adonai. We talked about that in last week's video. The words are being the 10 Commandments, as well as the ordinances. So he didn't just receive those 10 Commandments, he also received this set of community guidelines, laws, so on and so forth. And then he goes and tells the people about those words and those ordinances, and they agree to obey those words and to do as they're taught. And so it says in verse 4 that then Moses writes down all the words of Adonai, and then he builds an altar, and then he cuts a covenant with the people. Where we saw this back in Genesis chapter 17 with Abraham and God. I believe it's chapter 17 where God, Abraham cuts these animals all in half, and the custom is that both parties of the covenant walk through the dead animals that were cut in half, and what they're saying is that may what happened to these animals happen to us if we break this covenant. Way back then with God and Abraham, God put Abraham to sleep so that he couldn't walk through it, and this brazier or this furnace went through it, and so it was symbolic that God was saying, may I be cut in half if this thing doesn't happen, but for you, there's no consequence, because why? The covenant is one that I'm going to keep on my end. Here, the people are making the same kind of setup where they cut the offerings in half, they collect the blood, and they are symbolic. They're walking through it. Moses walking through it with the people. Maybe the elders are walking through it. We don't know. It says that the young men of the children of Israel sacrificed the burnt offering. So whoever it was, they walk through it, signifying that, hey, whatever happens with this, with us, according to this covenant. And so by cutting the animals in half, they signify, and then walking through it, they signify, okay, if we break the covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to us. If we keep the covenant, we'll be kept together. We will be blessed. And so that's how a covenant was enacted in those days, in those times, certainly in these contexts here with these passages. And so after that happens, it tells us that Moses, in verse 7, took the scroll of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. So he wrote down the words in a scroll. Now he's opening up the scroll again. He's reading it to everybody again, and they're, with this whole ceremony, and they're all agreeing to do what these ordinances say to do and to obey. And then Moses takes the blood, he sprinkles it on the people, and so in that you seal the covenant with blood in their agreements. It's kind of like a signature, the act you walk through, you sprinkled with blood. Now the covenant is sealed, and the relationship and the terms of that covenant are set. Now, so with that said, that this section is known as the Book of the Covenant. That's why I wanted to look at that there, so we had that context, that this is known as the Book of the Covenant. Now, chapter 21, now, with these ordinances, and the presupposition is that this is coming directly from God to Moses. And if you notice, the opening passages have to deal with slavery, and what you're very practically should be able to understand here, is that you have a people that's now leaving the bondage of slavery, I said earlier, and so they're going into this new lifestyle where they're free, and now they can have slaves themselves. And so God put some parameters around and conditions around the keeping of slaves, so that the people don't treat them the way that they were treated back in Egypt. And so the first section we see here has to do with time limits. How long can a person be kept as a servant or as a slave? In verse 2, we see that it's for a maximum of 6 years, and the seventh year to go free. Now, there's a very logical question here about the seventh year. Is that a reference to the year of freedom of Jubilee, where God is going to establish this practice of, you have 6 years of using land, and the seventh year you leave it alone, and so going along with the idea of a Sabbath day and a Sabbath week, where the seventh day you don't do anything, you don't collect the manna, you don't work, your animals don't work, your slaves don't work, your foreigners don't work, all of that we've seen already in previous passages. There's also the concept that every 7 years you're going to, just reset everything and let everything rest. And then there's a year of Jubilee, the 50th year. All debts are wiped out. All land is returned to people who it previously owned through. There's complete reset in everything that was going on in society. And so there's a question here about the seventh year. So if a servant comes into service, in 2 years away from the year of Jubilee, do we still count 6 for them and then set them free on the seventh? Or is that seventh year, the year that they're set free? And so it's a very real question to ask and wonder. And it's not just one that I ask. It's one that many commentators talked about. And the idea, consensus, is that this is related to not the service of the person, but in relation to the seventh year, the year of Jubilee, where things were set free. So in other words, if a Hebrew servant is taken, they're taken for the maximum that they could serve is 6 years. But on that seventh year, they do go free, even if that seventh year, the seventh year of the year of Jubilee, is 2 years after they go into service, then they go free. I hope that makes sense and is clarified. Actually, what I want to do real quick is go back to the beginning. It says, if you buy a Hebrew servant. So that translation says buy, some say acquire. The consensus there as well is that this wasn't like an open market for people, the way that the U.S. had slavery going on here in North America. It wasn't an open market for people. By buying or acquiring, what was being referred to was the idea of somebody who owed debts, who had to then pay those debts, and then the process of then taking on that person so that they could work to pay off their debts was the process of acquiring that person to be your servant or slave. So in other words, this type of slavery more closely resembles indentured servanthood, where someone agrees to work for a master to pay off a debt, so that, that because there's no other way for them to pay off that debt. They think that's the only way they can pay it off. And that's why the seventh year, the year of Jubilee, when all debts are set free, it makes sense then that they would go free as well, because those debts are released. And you no longer need them to work for you to pay off the debts that they have. Okay? So that's why that's like the full context of that. And in that context, though, a master would have the male slave, get with a bond servant of his or a female servant, like Hagar was to Abraham. And these are Near Eastern ancient cultures. These kinds of practices were kind of normalized. And the purpose of doing that, of putting them together, was so that they would have children. And those children, especially the sons, would belong then to the master, belong in the sense that they would belong to his household. Now, I want you to remember, Abraham had this system going. He had Hagar, was somebody that he actually took on as a wife, and then he had a son, and with Ishmael. But he also had others who were part of his household, like Eliezer, we've talked about last week, talked about before. He was the one that was like kind of in the top of Abraham's household, the one that Abraham thought maybe he could be the person to receive the blessing. And it seemed like, and God said, no, it's going to be one from your own loins and one from you and Sarah. And so it seemed like Eliezer wasn't his direct son, but it was someone who was part of his household and someone that he was willing to pass his household to. The idea there is that it would have been a son born to one of his bondservants, one of his slaves, we're going to use that word, one of his indentured servants, and so they would belong to the household. You can see in the way that Abraham treated that Eliezer, he didn't treat him like straight up property that he was going to own, that he would beat, that he would do whatever he wanted to with. No, he was giving that person a place of high esteem in his household. He gave him this great task to go and find his son a wife. He gave him, charge of the wealth. If you remember that story, he had all this gold and silver and everything, as he completely trusted Eliezer. And so it was just a different type of culture. And what God is saying here is, when in that situation, when that happens, if the man who was the father and the husband in that situation, if he wants to go his debts have been paid off and he wants to leave, okay, fine. Then the wife and the children belong to the master, in the sense that now he has to provide for them and he's responsible for them and taking care of them. But if he loves her and he's like, I want to stay with them, in other words, like you can imagine, like the situation in the home is so loving and kind. The master is a good master. He pays well. He's not burdensome. Then what happens is the male servant can choose to remain a servant. It says in perpetuity, forever, with this master. So because the sons and the bond servant, like the idea of like they're his household. So basically, you're marrying into his household. The idea of a covenant being entered into. Okay, so this male servant from the outside who was acquired because of his debt, he now joins the household in a more formal way, and so now they're all one family. And so you're going to be a family. You're going to serve this one person for the rest of your life. That's the idea there. And then there's a whole thing there with the doorpost and piercing his ear through with an awl, and you'll serve him forever. In verse 6, it says you'll bring him to God. The translation says Elohim. It's the plural of God. It's bring them to the gods. It points to the ancient nature of this text. The idea is that God, we've talked about this before, God is God. Adonai is the top God. But the people might have other gods, right? And so they're learning how to move past it. And in the writing of these laws, a very ancient text, the idea of sticking with that idea of like there is only one God, there's only one God. It in the writing, it just kind of didn't connect for the writer, even if it was directly Moses. And he put in that plural form, and because there's a whole cultural aspect of that where people would keep their gods, their foreign gods, at their doorposts, and so that's where you take them to the doorpost, you pierce them with all. It's like a witness between you and your gods, kind of like so whoever your gods are, you go and you do that. Very ancient. Again, text, and eventually the editing and the writing will change to a more singular view of a monotheistic God, that there is only one God and that's who you speak to. But that's just why that's there. A lot of translations do what my translation did here, just make it the singular God, knowing what will eventually become the accepted norm of worship and belief systems. Other translations will say judges there because they know it's a plural, and they look at the rest of the passages and they're like, okay, it's maybe this is the idea of going in front of a judge, the elders, Moses' assessment he's going to set up. Maybe that's the idea. A lot of reasonings as to why they're uncomfortable with saying gods, but that's like I always say, I always want to kind of explain the full context of that kind of stuff so that none of you are taken by surprise if you hear someone bring that up and then you don't know what to say to them. So the next portion is about a man who is selling his daughter. Again, the idea here is related to debts, and the idea here is that the father is so much in debt that the only way he can kind of make up some of that money is if he gets a bridal price for his daughter, and so he sells his daughter. And so she goes into another family. Now she belongs to them. Now, but notice this in verse 8. If the master has a problem with her, whatever, he's allowed her to be redeemed. She's allowed to be brought back at a price. But he can't sell her away to someone else because he's deceitfully dealt with her. And so the onus is on the person who's taking on this young woman. It's like you weren't honest with why you wanted to have her. If you wanted to marry her, you wanted her to marry your first son, your second son, you wanted to have kids, or you wanted to use her for this or that or the other, and then she got there and she's like, I don't want to do that. Like, that's not why my dad sent me over here. The deal was for me to marry your son and to be part of your family. And what the law is saying here is that, okay, that's all happening. You're the one that was deceitful in acquiring her. And so you can't just go and sell her to someone else like she's yours, because she's not. So it says in verse 9, if he betroths her to a son, he must give her the rights of a daughter. And that's the whole, he dealt deceitfully. And then, she doesn't please me. It's like, oh, I don't want her to marry that son. I'd rather her marry somebody else. And that points back to, if you've been following along with the studies, what Judah did with Tamar. He was supposed to give Tamar, she married his eldest son. His eldest son was twisted in his thinking, and then and he died. And then the second son was twisted in his thinking, and then he ended up dying, and she had no sons. And so Judah was obligated to let his youngest son be her next husband once he was old enough. But then it tells us that Judah didn't want that to happen, thinking she was the reason why the boys kept dying, not realizing that his own sons were the reason. They were the ones doing things that they shouldn't do. And so there was that whole thing where she tricks him into sleeping with her, and she gets pregnant, and that's where Judah ends up having some children. So that's the idea. That's where we're coming from. And so in verse 10, it's like, if he takes another wife, he's not to diminish her food. So it's like, you did marry her off, but then you get another wife, you're not supposed to treat her any differently. And if you don't take care of her with all three of these things, then you got to let her go free. Okay, and so that's where, again, the perspective is changing. And yes, it does stink. It stinks to think of how people were treated as property in that sense, where it's like, oh, here's a value, here's my daughter, I get money. It really does stink, and it stink. Like it sucks to hear and to think about, because women and people of color have throughout history been the victims of these types of views of people, where people are property. Historically, they've been victimized by societies for their perceived value. And so it really does stink where we're now in 2025 and we're looking at it and we're like, yeah, we don't want this kind of thing. Even in India, the whole idea of a dowry is not supposed to be talked about, and it's, it's against the law, and because they don't want the families, making those deals and treating their children like property. And that's why when you look at these ordinances, the way they're written, we see that there is a difference. We compare them to other codes of law. The treatment of human beings and the uplifting of them beyond just value is evident. The fact that they have to let people free, the fact that the woman has to be taken care of well according to the law there. If not, she has to be set free. Later on in chapter 23, if you abuse your servants, you knock a tooth out, you damage their eye, you have to let them go free. There's a lot of clauses there that initiate this understanding that the relationship between master and slave, or master and woman, female servant, is not going to be the same as it was for them in Egypt. And I think that's one of the reasons why the ordinances start that way, is because God knows when we start off, we've recovered from some kind of evil, we go forward, we're more likely to continue cycles of evil, even in our newfound freedom, than we are to set others free, or choose to not put people through the same kinds of bondage or torment that we went through. As human beings, it's kind of like it's more natural to say, well, I went through that, so they can go through that, rather than say, I don't want them to go through that, so I'm not going to allow them to go through that. And that's what God is doing with these ordinances through Moses. He's saying the approach for you going forward is going to be different. I don't want you to treat others the way that you were treated. That for sure is evident in the readings here. So we'll continue on, and then we get to sections related to capital punishment. Murder is the first thing discussed. Verse 12, whoever strikes a man so he dies, surely be put to death. Again, this whole idea of capital punishment for murder goes back to Noah and goes back even further to Cain. And we've discussed that before in the past, but just real quickly, the way of Cain, the way the world ended up to then be destroyed by the flood, was that murder was unchecked. When someone murdered, God said, okay, I'll mark you. And because Cain was like, no, someone's going to kill me. And God marked him and allowed him to live. But that led to a legacy going to Cain's relative later, many years later, Lamech, who then was boasting about murder. killing a young boy who spoke badly about him. And so the way of the world went very dark without curbing specifically the evil action of murder. And so when Noah came out of the ark, the very first covenant God made with him outside of the rainbow and never flooding again was, to deal with murder directly and with capital punishment. And so it makes sense here that God continues after dealing with issues related to people and treating people and dignity and slavery and everything else and making sure that they don't repeat the same evils committed against them. He goes to the concept of murder and he says, you have to put to death those who commit murder, those who are guilty. But if he does not hunt them down, yet God caused it to happen, I'll appoint a place where he may run. What does that mean? So here's where caveats are given. It's understood that sometimes someone would die at the hand of someone else, but it's an accident. And in that accident, then it's something God did, not what the person did. And so what God is going to do is create a system of sanctuary cities where people could run to and stay so that the avenger of that person who was murdered doesn't kill them. Otherwise, if they're found, they could be killed and then they're kind of guilty and that's kind of set. So that was kind of like an ancient system there. But again, we're looking at this as not cut black and white. It's just not wet and dry. It's not pure opposite. Sometimes we have middle ground. Sometimes people will die and it's not it's an accident and so we have to deal with those situations. And so we look at verse 14. It says, if a man presumes to kill his neighbor with craftiness, be taken from the altar. And so what's being spoken about there is the idea of premeditated murder. The idea of someone planning out a way to murder somebody, right? And thinking about all the steps and getting it done. For that, a person cannot even be saved if they grab onto the horns of the altar. And that's a reference to verse 13, the whole like running to a safe place so that, an avenger doesn't kill someone when an accident happens or you feel like you're not guilty. So that's where they could go. But if a person goes and runs to the altar and they're guilty, they're guilty of premeditated murder, where they were crafty and they devised a way for murder, then that won't save them. Now, so what I want to do now is look at a couple passages in 1 Kings related to this whole intentional murder thing and running to the horns for sanctuary. In 1 Kings chapter 1, there's a story about Adoniah wanting to become the king, and so he kind of puts himself up there, and Solomon is eventually chosen by David to be the king, and then Solomon is anointed by David and everything else. And so when Adoniah hears that about Solomon, that he's been picked by David to be the next king, he's been anointed, he gets afraid and he goes to grab the horns of the altar. You see that in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 50 there on the screen. And then so Solomon hears about it. He hears that Adoniah has held on to the altar. He's saying, let Solomon swear he's not going to kill me, not going to put me to death before I let go of these horns. And so Solomon makes a promise and he says, okay, if there's no wickedness found in him, it's fine. Not a hair will fall on him, but if there is wickedness found in him, he will die. And so Solomon lets him go. And then if we go into chapter 2 has that whole narrative about David telling Solomon that he wants Joab killed and everybody else that did him wrong. And so what ends up happening is Solomon plays the long game. He waits for revolt, and so he sees Adoniah tries to get with one of David's concubines. We saw that with Judah. It's a symbolic act to say that you're taking your father's position when you take your father's concubine. And so Adoniah, by requesting from Bathsheba that he could have David's concubine, was trying to do it in a sneaky way, but got caught. It was found out. It was known once Solomon heard it from Bathsheba. Is like, what? Okay, so he wants to take David's place. He wants to have David's concubine, my father's concubine. He wants to be king. So that's how he interpreted that. And so he found wickedness in him, and so he sentenced Adoniah to die. And then Joab heard about it, and it tells us in chapter 2, verse 28, that he fled to the tent of Adonai and grasped the horns of the altar. And he's running for sanctuary, like we saw the provision that's in chapter 21, Exodus chapter 21, verse 13. Because it says Joab had defected to Adoniah, even though he didn't defect to Absalom. So he knows that he's in trouble here, and he doesn't want to be killed, and so he goes to hold on to the altar. And Benaniah tells this to Solomon, and Solomon says that what's going to happen is he's going to die, and ultimately it's going to be because he's guilty of murder. In verse 32, it says, return his blood on his own head because he struck down two men more righteous and better than he. And so specifically looking at this verse, chapter 4 in Exodus chapter 21, and verse 14 says that if someone with craftiness kills somebody else, even if they grab onto the horns of the altar, they should be put to death. And so Joab is dragged out of there, and because that's exactly what he did. The two people that he's guilty of killing there in 1 Kings, he planned those things out. And when David heard about it, David was very passive about all this stuff. He didn't want to kill Joab. On his deathbed is when he told Solomon, get revenge and said all these things for me. And that's why Solomon ended up being the one to carry out the law, actually. The law was, if you do it by craftiness, even if they hold on to the altar, they should be killed. Then after that, we transition to abuse of parents. That's both physical abuse in verse 15 and also abuse that comes through words, through curses. And then there's I mentioned this earlier, that Deuteronomy is like an expansion of these laws. And so I wanted to see in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18, it says, suppose a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who doesn't listen to the voice of his father or his mother. They discipline him, but he doesn't listen to him. Then his father and mother to grab hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the city. They'll say, the son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He doesn't listen to our voice. He's a glutton and a drunkard, and then they will stone him to death. That's an expansion of the idea of what's going on here in verses 14 or 15 with the strike his father or mother shall be put to death. And in verse 17, whoever curses his father or mother shall be put to death. And just, it seems, rebellious and stubborn. Oh, what kid isn't like that? It says there, he was a glutton, he was a drunkard. So he's an adult son. He's a man. It's not just, a child who's going out and doing that kind of stuff. And he's also cursing his parents. And that's why this law is written there, because this was a problem in those cultures where you had children rise up, curse their parents this way, and it was a dishonor to the parents and could even lead to their own death and own trouble in their communities. Verse 16 in between says, anyone who steals a person and sells him or is found with him under his hand must be put to death. So that's actually speaking out to the death penalty for kidnappers. If you remember back in the law, we had do not steal. So this is one of those aspects of do not steal. We're not supposed to steal each other. So kidnapping. So we have death penalties for murder or, premeditated murder. We have death penalty for the abuse of parents, both physical and abusive, which can also be called elder abuse. And then we have abuse related to kidnapping, stealing people. That's usually for slavery. You take children, kind of like Joseph too, sold into slavery. That kind of thing God is saying we're not going to do. As a community that is going to be a holy nation of priests for me in this world, these are things you cannot do, things that the world does that you cannot. And so the ultimate punishment is death, to make sure that these things don't grow within your people. So we look at verse 18, we have some laws here about bodily injury and making sure we make restitution for those people that we are responsible for hurting. It doesn't matter that these two people are fighting. It says if two people are fighting, one strikes the other, and the other one doesn't die, but he lies in bed and he gets up again, he walks around his staff, then that one that struck him has to make sure that he's cleared from the debts, right? Because if the person can't work, they're injured, they're laying in bed, they can't get up and go to work, then they're going to accumulate debt. Then they're going to have to sell themselves into slavery or sell their daughter to try to pay back those debts. That's not right. So God's establishing a system here of not only retribution for those capital offenses, which is retribution with death, but then here it's restitution. So we have retribution and restitution with God. In verse 20, we have a similar idea. It's about a master striking his male or female servant. It says, if the person dies by his hand, they'll surely be punished. Okay, so that idea is set there so that a master doesn't go ahead and beat their servant to the point where they could die. And then it says in verse 21, he will not be punished for his property. And that right there is one of those places like, ugh, cringe. But here's the better understanding, and it really comes down to translation again, and then also the context of what's being said here. What's being said here is that, okay, the master has beaten his servant. The servant can't work. The master won't be punished because in losing the servant for a few days, he's already encountering loss because that person is supposed to be working for him and paying off debt. And so, yes, the master won't be punished because the person is supposed to be working for him and paying off debt anyway. And so the idea is the master takes the loss. The master beat the person to the point where they can't work. Okay, so then your person gets to have days off. They get to recover. And then don't expect them to accumulate extra debt because they weren't working. No, you take the loss. You take the loss in that sense. It's your responsibility. That's what it means by for he is his property. So the responsibility of the time not being worked and the wages, being paid off or the debt being paid off is on that person, the master who beat him. So if they beat him too much and they die, okay, you're going to get punished. If you beat them and they don't die, but they can't work, then guess who's out the money? So the way these things are worded, they're worded in order to make sure that a person thinks twice, 3 times, 4 times before they go into that mode of, okay, I'm going to beat them because they did something wrong. Get it? They're just like so the context is like the master's thinking, wait a minute, if I hit this guy and he doesn't want to work tomorrow, or he can't work tomorrow, then I'm going to be out of work, or let me not do that. And so it's supposed to get people thinking differently about how they treat the servants, realizing their own loss, that they can't compile losses onto the person who's supposed to work with them. I hope that makes sense. But that's how I understand it, and I read a lot, and you can tell I read a lot because I'm talking a lot, but I did read a lot, and that's just where I settled with the wording there in that verse. And then verse 22 says, if a man fight and a pregnant woman gives birth early, then there's a miscarriage, and so there's supposed to be restitution there. And then in verse 24, if any harm follows, and you're to penalize life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for a wound, both blow for a blow. And then in verse 26, it says, if a man strikes the eye of his male or his servant, then the male is set free. I mentioned that earlier. And then in verse 23 and 24 says, you are to penalize him life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for a wound. And blow for a blow. So this is known as the law of retaliation. It's made really well known and famous by the Code of Hammurabi, which is another ancient code of laws. It's kind of repeated throughout different ancient cultures, this idea of retaliation. But I want to make it clear that the idea in Judaism and the way the rabbis then taught it from here on out, you have to keep it all in context. And so far in context, the only thing that's paid back directly is the act of murder. Everything else in context is paid back with restitution, and restitution in terms of money. We're not going to go through all the passages later on. There's like passages about theft. If you take someone's, donkey or their goat or whatever, and it's found alive, like every rule that comes into play after these sections, what we see with our own eyes is that the responsibility is to pay back what was lost. And so what Moses is saying is not what other cultures said here about law of retaliation, where someone has they take an eye, you take an eye. That's not how it goes. And the context is immediate. In verse 26, it says, if a man strikes the eye of his male or his female slave and destroys it, he must let him go free for the sake of his eyesight. So previously it says eye for an eye. So it doesn't say, though, knock out his eye. It says set him free. Restitution. And what's restitution for the servant that's had his eye damaged so he can't see now? Is to be set free. He doesn't have to work for you anymore. Look at verse 24 again. Tooth for a tooth. In verse 27, if he strikes out his slave's tooth, he must let him go free for the sake of the tooth. So the idea is restitution, not retribution, not retaliation here. It's restitution, is paying back. Understanding that you've gone too far. And the tooth that you're going to lose is a servant who, and whatever debt they owed you, you've lost it. You eat it. He's not going to work that off for you anymore because you knocked his tooth out. And so restitution. Hope that's made clear. That I think that the text is very honest about that. And so it's then connected to the idea of negligence. The idea there's like an ox goes and kills somebody, then the ox is the one that will be killed, and then the meat is not to be eaten. There's something going on with that ox. We're going to go ahead and kill it. Maybe it's got mad ox disease or something, so just let it go. But if the owner knows that the ox was given to goring, then it goes out and it's not kept pent up. It's not stoned. It goes out and kills somebody. Then the ox must be stoned, and then the owner must be put to death. So here we have, again, the only retribution, retaliation for sin that's not monetary that I've been looking at this so far is death. And so negligence in this sense that causes the death of another, the cost is death. Now there is a loophole. They could also pay a ransom. So there's a loophole there. So there's death for negligence or restitution. So if it's like, oh man, my ox killed your guy, and didn't your ox kill a guy 2 weeks ago? Yeah, he did. Well, then we need to stone you. Like that's the law. It's like, oh, I'll pay. How much is it worth? How much was the person worth? How much was their debt? I'll pay that off for you. That kind of thing. And then there's also negligence with covering pits and digging pits. So you dig a pit, you don't cover it up. The ox or donkey falls in it. They have to pay compensation. If another ox hurts another man's ox and they're supposed to sell the live ox and divide the price, it's restitution. It's restitution. It's restitution. There's if a man steals an ox or sheep and kills it or sells it, he has to pay 5 oxen for 1 ox. So the restitution there is like exponential. 5 oxen for 1 ox. So it's like, do I want to steal? If I get caught, then I sell it. I got to pay a lot more. And so that's where chapter 22 continues with this kind of idea. It's to, look, you see there in verse 3 I highlighted, he's to pay double. In verse 4, he's to pay restitution. In verse 5, the one who lit the fire must make full restitution. That has to do with field. So in verse 4, it's that you let an animal loose, they eat stuff from your field and they eat way too much and you have to pay them back. If you set fire trying to kill thorns, which I found out recently people in the U.S. still do that kind of thing, so it seems dangerous, but people do it. If you burn down other people's yards and lands, their stalks of grain where they could have made money, you make restitution. If a man lends something to someone for safekeeping and the person loses that, they have to pay double. Like if a thief comes and gets it, so you're supposed to make extra care of someone else's stuff while you're in possession of it. You're extra responsible for it. The thief isn't found, and the master is to present himself to God. So in verse 7, it's a really interesting concept there that's going to be developed later on in the Torah. If you're familiar with the scriptures, you may be familiar with Urim and Thummim. And the idea was that there were like these 2 lots, that lots mean like dice. Think about dice, like these 2 stones that were smooth, had 6 sides or whatever. We don't really know how many sides they had, but it could have been one. Well, they couldn't be one-sided, but they would have, one would mean yes and one would say no, basically. And so you would throw them and you would understand that in throwing them, you were divining God's answer in this situation where you're trying to figure out. And so you're supposed to ask yes or no questions. It's kind of like Magic 8 Ball, right? Like, am I going to have fun time tonight? So it's weird to think, but this is later on the system that Moses is going to institute with God's direction. And so that's what this means. They present themselves to God, and this is where we see the transition to the singular form of God, the one true God. And so it's like, oh, is this guy guilty? Cast the lots, and then we find out. And what I thought about when I heard about all this was the story of Achan, who stole from Jericho, and then they went to go fight in Ai, and then they lost, and they didn't know who it was that broke the law, who stole, who did what God told them not to do. And so they started casting lots and narrowed down to tribe, then it narrowed down to clan, and then family, and then boom, they went ahead and punished those who the lots fell on. And so that's the idea. We're going to bring them before God and let God let us know. And they really did believe that this is something God would do. And then it would say that God would be the one convict him to pay his neighbor double. In verse 9, a neighbor entrusts his neighbor with a donkey or sheep. And so you give something to someone, like earlier, like a bailment, or you're trusting someone. There has to be an oath between them to determine whether or not he has laid his hand on his neighbor's goods. So if something goes missing, they lay an oath. And in laying that oath, the punishment would then be known because you're laying an oath before God, and God will let it know, okay, you broke the oath, you broke the covenant, it was you that stolen, and so they're supposed to make restitution. If it's torn in pieces, bring in evidence. So torn in pieces means like, you're taking care of someone's animal, they went on vacation, you're taking care of them, and then another animal killed it, like a lion or something. So then you want to bring those pieces there to say, hey, this is what happened, and so you're not responsible. If not, you must make full restitution, full restitution, full restitution. And then there's a switch to verse 15 about, it says seducing, it's having sexual relations with a young girl before you're betrothed or engaged to them. This is not about rape. This is about consensual sex that happens. And then in that context, okay, now the man is required to marry this woman and make her his wife, and he has to pay, the father, the dowry or whatever that he's supposed to pay. It says, though, if the father utterly refuses to give her, then he has to weigh out silver equal to the dowry. So he still has to make that payment. Then we get back to some capital punishments. In verse 17, sorcerers should not live. They tended to be women, but they could be males too. It's just it usually a female kind of role in a lot of pagan worships or worship systems to do that. To be a witch, and we see in the story of Saul that he actually killed all the witches except the one that he ends up going to talk to Samuel. In verse 18, anyone who lies with an animal, so bestiality is outlawed. Anyone who sacrifices to other gods except Adonai alone, so the worship of other gods and idolatry is not allowed. Verse 20, you must not exploit or oppress an outsider, for you are outsiders in the land of Egypt. You must not mistreat any widow or orphan. You must not mistreat them in any way or hear their cry. This is going to be a recurring theme throughout the law. The treatment of outsiders, of foreigners, of widows, and orphans is something that God takes extremely seriously. In the book of Deuteronomy, we see that God actually says that he loves the foreigner, he loves the outsider. When he looks at the person who's walking and wandering in this world without a home, he sees someone that relates to him, because he is also someone who walks and wanders around this world without a home. And yes, we could spiritualize it, and the church is his body and all that kind of thing, but there's a reason why we look at these prophecies and God coming back, and why they're even there is because eventually what God wants to do is establish a physical presence here on earth. And so he sees us. We are containers for him. We're walking around this world. We are strangers. We're aliens. We're foreigners. We don't belong to any country, any nation. We live in one. We're citizens of them. We're responsible to pay our taxes, to follow the laws. But ultimately, we belong to God, and we have to understand that this place, this earth, is not our home until he makes it his. Until then, we belong to him. He belongs to us, and that's our inheritance. And so that's going to be a recurring theme. How do you treat the outsider? How do you treat the widow? How do you treat the orphan? I'm going to look at you and see how you do that. He goes, if you lend money to my people, don't charge interest like a debt collector. You see that in verse 24. We don't follow that law at all. In verse 25, it says, you take a cloak as a pledge. Now, the idea is the outer garment. So if a guy's like, okay, I need to borrow money, say, okay, here's the money. What are you going to give me to make sure that you pay me back? Because I promise, your pledge. The only thing I can give you is his cloak, his outer cloak. That's how destitute he is. That's how poor he is. That's how much trouble he's in when it comes to finances. He's got to give you his outer cloak. And so what God says is that that's his only covering, his cloak for his skin. So what's he going to sleep in? So what I want you to do, you take the cloak, okay, but give it back to him and say, you keep this because it's yours and you need this to sleep in. And God will hear that because he's gracious. God will see that because you are gracious. And so there's a really important point about God's heart brought up there. In verse 27, it says, don't despise God or curse a ruler of your people. In verse 28, don't hold back the fullness of your crops. You're to give the firstborns to him. So everything belongs to God. And in verse 30, you're to be a holy people, you've seen before. Now, in chapter 23, we see reflections here about justice and reflections in the Ten Commandments about lying and false oaths and vain. And so God says here, don't do that. Don't be a malicious witness. Don't follow a crowd and pervert justice. Don't If you see your enemy's ox, bring it back to him. That's an act of kindness towards your enemy. If you see the donkey of the one who hates you lying down under his burden, don't leave it. You're to release it with him. So God is saying you're supposed to show acts of kindness and love even to your enemies. You're not to pervert justice to the poor. You're also not supposed to favor the poor just because they're poor. God cares about partiality on both sides of the social wealth kind of stratum there, with high class, low class, whatever. God is fair and just with everybody. He says, don't kill the innocent with the righteous, for I will not justify the guilty. One of the problems we have in this country, there are too many people on death row that are innocent. There are too many people in the past who have been murdered after being accused of murder who are not murderers. So that's why, if you ever wonder why, people will fight against it. Oh, the law says you have to kill those who are murderers, but it also says don't kill those who are innocent. So if you have innocent people who are there, that's against God's way. That's against God's law. And so I hope that can click in your mind, whoever's watching. That's why there are people who are against the death penalty. It's because there are innocent people who are put to death under those laws, and that's not right. Don't take bribes. Again, it's about justice. Don't oppress the outsider. It's about justice. In the 7th year, let the ground rest. That's about the Sabbath. In the 6 days, you will work. And 7th day, you will rest. So your ox and your donkey. So here the Sabbath is brought up as related to the 10 Commandments. It says, make no mention of names of other gods. Again, only worship this one God. Now, chapter 23 closes out with 3 festivals. You're supposed to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Remember, that's the feast that begins the night that Passover ends. You have the Passover meal, the lamb. And then right there, you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which goes on for 7 days. And he says, you will not eat matzah. That's as a commanded. So it's like bread with leaven in it. And you're supposed to take out the hametz, the leaven. And so the idea is related to the whole concept of Passover. Before Passover, you're supposed to remove all leaven. And so when it comes to Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, don't put those two things together, because at that point you're supposed to have, gotten rid of all the leaven from the house. The next festival is the Feast of Harvest. That's the Feast of First Fruits. It later becomes known as Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of First Fruits, as mentioned earlier. It's also connected with this moment here, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And it's also, for those of us who believe in Yeshua, the festival that's known or celebrated as Pentecost, the day that they receive the Spirit of God. The disciples receive the Spirit of God in Acts chapter 2. These are all connected. And so what goes on there is you collect the first fruits of the harvest, and you present them to God as an offering, which earlier we saw God says, don't withhold that from me. And then the final feast is the Feast of Ingathering. That's the final harvest. That's known as Sukkot. That's the Feast of Tabernacles, a feast of booths. It's supposed to happen in the fall. It is supposed to recall living in the wilderness, in tents, in booths, with the pillar of God before them, looking at God as He leads them, and remembering those days of great blessing and great peace in the wilderness, a time where they could walk and walk and walk, and their shoes wouldn't wear out, their clothes wouldn't wear out. That kind of miraculous kind of time, that even though they were kind of judged for not believing going into the land for, they still had this kind of amazing, blessed, protected time, those 40 years wandering in the desert. And so they celebrate that. And so those are the 3 times a year it says they're supposed to appear before Adonai Elohim. Now later on, they established Jerusalem as the place where the temple is, and so it became a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But ultimately, the idea was wherever it was that God was met at, or you met God at, you performed sacrifices at, that's where everyone would go for these festivals. And so the first place they do that when they enter into the promised land with Joshua is at Gilgal. It's a site where they first do that. And so you'll see or read that they go to Gilgal. Then they'll go to a place called Shiloh. Later on, you'll see the people of Israel go up to a place called Shiloh to worship together. And so wherever it is that God establishes His name, that's where everyone is supposed to go. Those are 3 pilgrimages. And so you see even Yeshua follows that in obedience. He goes to Jerusalem during those times of year. Going back to the laws, it says, do not offer the blood of my sacrifice with hametz. That's what I was thinking about earlier. That's the leaven. So at this point, leaven is supposed to be removed. So don't offer that sacrifice with any kind of leaven. Because again, it's supposed to be removed all out of the house. It's not supposed to be there. Nor is the fat supposed to remain out. That's supposed to be burned and given to God right away. The first thing burned up for God. The choicest first fruits come. Do not boil a kid in his mother's milk. Now, there's a lot of conversation. We don't have conversation, just a lot of reading and there's texts and commentaries about what this means, that this was like an old pagan ritual, and she's like, God's like, don't do that, and so on and so forth. I was studying it. I think the Spirit gave me this very clear just understanding. The rules here relate back to Passover and what's supposed to be done in going up to Passover in the unleavened bread festival. And so I said, okay, what's the rule then with the lamb that's sacrificed related to this festival? It's supposed to be a lamb that's only a year old, but it has to be at least a year old. So I was wondering about this, so I looked this up, and so at most, a female, the mother, will provide milk for about 6 months to its child, the baby lamb. After that, the baby lamb starts to grow up and is without milk for food and is eating, whatever else that the adults eat. And so that changes the flavor and the texture of the meat. Even a year-old lamb, while it sounds like it's going to be delicate, is not going to be as tender as a 3-month-old lamb, or a 1-month-old lamb, or a 4-month-old lamb, or a 6-month-old lamb, right? You get it. Because at those times, they're just drinking milk. And so the meat is more tender, it's more, savory to eat and all that kind of stuff, easier to season. And so God specifically said, don't cook the kid in a mother's milk, which means don't kill and offer up a sacrifice that's younger than a year old to me. That goes against the general guidelines of what the Passover lamb was supposed to be. It's supposed to be a mature 1-year-old lamb. After that final point there about the festivals, which I think that's what that is, it's those verses are for the festivals. We see some verses about how God is going to prepare them and bring them into the land. He's going to send them with an angel that's going to go before them. It's going to guard them. He warns them not to rebel because he won't pardon their transgression. My name is in him. So he's saying he's my representative. If you do everything, I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you. In verse 24, you're not to bow down to their gods or serve them. So in verse 25, he says, you're to serve Adonai your God. He will bless you, your food, your water. So you're going to have, stuff to eat, drink. Sickness is going to go away from you. No one in your land will miscarry or be barren. So you're going to be fertile. You're going to fill up. I will send my terror before you. I will send the hornet before you. Those are references to one of the plagues of Egypt, like how God's going to send something before them so that they don't even have to fight. The people are going to be in a panic, it says. They're going to turn their backs. You're going to drive them out, and you'll walk right in. But in verse 29, it says, I won't do this in a single year. It's going to take time. Otherwise, the land will become desolate. It's going to become useless. So what God says, little by little, I will drive them out, and then you will take their land, and then you'll grow, and then I'll drive out the next one, and they'll go. So in other words, what we read in Joshua, not supposed to happen that way, where they have to go and conquer Jericho and Ai and go to town. If they follow the covenant, God's going to chase the people out. There's going to be plague, there's going to be sickness, and they're going to turn their backs. And so the Israelites can just walk in, and they're just going to do it progressively, step by step, without fighting, and allow God to clear the land. And in that way, they can continue to grow and grow into the nation, and that way the land doesn't become useless as no one's living there. Then he says what their border is going to be from the Sea of Reeds, that's way down by where Egypt is, all the way the Sea of the Philistines, which is the Mediterranean Sea, and then up to the Euphrates River, just way north into Lebanese territory, which is Lebanon today. And so he's going to give them this huge land. He's going to deliver those inhabitants to them, and you'll drive them out. And so he says, as is happening, they're going to turn their backs. Don't make any covenants, deals with them to make sure that they can stay. And then this is verse 33, they won't dwell in your land. Make sure they don't stay, because they will be a snare to you. And that's how that closes. Now, we looked at chapter 24 and some of the key factors there already. What we see in verse 1 is that Adonai says to Moses, bring up Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, those are his 2 sons, and the 70 elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone is supposed to come. And we see that Moses writes down the words in the book of the covenant, and then they build an altar, and then the burnt sacrifices are done, the covenant is cut, Moses sprinkles the blood, the covenant, and that seals it. And notice in verse 9, it says, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up. They went up to the mountain. In verse 1, it says, don't come up here. Just Moses. Verse 10, they saw the God of Israel. And under his feet was something like the pavement of sapphire, as clear as the very heavens. So they could see, they saw something clear that was blue. Other translations say lapis lazuli. It's a blue color, but it's clear, and they could see his feet. And what happens in verse 11? He did not raise his hand against the nobles. And behold, they beheld God, and they ate and they drank. And so I said, this festival, Shavuot, the giving of the Torah to the people and the ordinances, the law and the covenant, it also symbolizes the first time they gather together and they have a meal with God. Now, what changes between verse 1 and this verse here, where God's like, stay away, and now they're right under and they can see? It's the sealing of the covenant with the sprinkling of the blood. At this moment, they have been consecrated, which they had to do earlier. They washed their cloaks and everything. Now they've been sealed, they've been sprinkled, they've been sanctified by God and by the act of the atonement and the sacrifices and the sealing of the covenant, all that good stuff. Now they're able to enter into that presence and actually see God. And so that's why Shavuot is celebrated. And then in verse 12, God tells Moses, come up here, I'll give you tablets of stone. So he's going to write down his own copy. And then Moses goes up there, up to the mountain of God, and he tells them to wait. Okay, so now we continue on with Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 25 and 26. It says, if I have not made my covenant of day and night firm, and the fixed patterns of ordering the heavens and the earth, only then would I reject the offspring of Jacob and of my servant David, so that I would not take from his offspring rulers over the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For I will restore them from their exile and have compassion on them. What is God saying? He's saying that the covenant we saw there in Exodus chapter 21 through 24, and how it's sealed there with the blood and all that stuff we just covered, that covenant it was possible to break that covenant. That's the covenant they did break. You read earlier on in Jeremiah. What God is referring to here is an older covenant, a covenant that was established before the one we just read in Exodus, one that's as old as God's covenant with the heavens and the earth and the stars in the sky. In other words, God made a system of laws that he considers a covenant with the heavens and the moon and the stars and all the lights and everything else. And that's a very ancient, old covenant that goes back to creation, Genesis chapter 1. And we know that those things won't change until the final day of creation, and there's a new heavens and a new earth. So God is saying, like that covenant, I made a covenant with Abraham, one that goes back and one that's going to extend for all times. And that covenant is one that goes through Abraham to his offspring. And so what he says there is that he would not take from his offspring rulers over the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's saying the covenant with Abraham is greater than the covenant with anybody else. That's the first portion from Jeremiah that we have. So our second portion of Jeremiah highlights the breaking of a covenant between the people, and how God is going to see the breaking of that covenant as the kind of final straw in the breaking of his covenant, the covenant that he made back in Exodus chapter 24 that was sealed back there with the people. So it says in verse 8 that the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, and this word came after Zedekiah had cut a covenant with his people. In verse 9 it says, so that everyone should let his manservant, his maidservant, Hebrew man or Hebrew woman, go free. And so what it's saying here is that Zedekiah, the king of the south, the king of Judah, had made a deal with everybody in the south in his kingdom to set all the slaves go free, all the servants. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar was there and was sieging the area, and so we need to, enlist more people to wage this war against Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar then turned around and went back. And then what Zedekiah did was he re-enslaved everybody he had set free. That's what it tells us here. So after all that had happened is when Jeremiah receives this word. But you see in verse 10, it says, so all the princes and all the people obeyed, they entered the covenant. And then in verse 11, but afterward they turned around and made the servants and the handmaids whom they had let go free return and brought them back into subjection as servants and handmaids. So earlier it told us that the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. It told us when it came after this whole thing. And now we see in verse 12 what the word of Adonai is. And it says, I've made a covenant with your fathers in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, of the house of bondage. That's referring to what we just finished studying in Exodus chapter 24. And it says, at the end of 7 years, you're supposed to set free every man his brother who's a Hebrew who's been sold to you. We just saw all of that, and it's certainly true. It's not anything they shouldn't know. But your fathers did not obey me, nor incline their ear. And now you had repented, because in setting them free, it was an act of repentance. Okay, we're going to turn back to our covenant with God. By the way, the definition of repentance is turning back to the terms of covenant with God. That's the idea of repentance, turning back to it. And so for this context here, they repented. They went back to their covenant. They let the slaves free like they were supposed to, and had done that which is right in my eyes by proclaiming liberty to everybody. You even made a covenant before me in the house where my name is called. So he's talking about the temple there, Solomon's temple. But then you turn around and profane my name. Everybody went back into subjection. They all went back into slavery. And so what God says is why it was important to look at the end of chapter 23. To the sword, to the plague, and to the famine is where I set you free. So if you look at the context of chapter 23, God's saying, I'm going to protect you from the sword, from plague, from famine. There's food and water, everything's going to be blessed. I'm going to protect you from that. Because we're sealed in this covenant. That's what I'm going to do. You follow me, I'm going to protect you. But you went ahead and did this and put them back into slavery. So what I'm going to do is set you free to go ahead and experience the things that I've been protecting you from. So I'm going to let you out of my hands. And that's going to be the sword, the plague, and the famine. And I'll make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. So everything is supposed to happen to the other kingdoms as they drive them out. At this point, all that has happened. There, two kingdoms now split. The northern kingdom has been taken for some time now. But now the judgment has fallen upon the southern kingdom, and their covenant is officially broken and ended with God. And so that's where, again, all the Jewish synagogues and temples and everything else, that's where they're going to end their sermons this week as they look at these Torah portions and study these scriptures from the prophets. Now, for those of us who believe in Yeshua as Messiah, as we look at these passages here, in Matthew, we're going to see Jesus, Yeshua, go beyond what God was trying to establish as a new order for his people as they left Egypt and left the bondage of slavery. In verse 38, it says, you've heard an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What he's saying is, you've heard about the restitution law. And just to make it clear, that I'm not just making that up, David Stern, in his New Testament commentary, writes from the Mishnah citation, explaining what the law of retaliation or the eye for the eye actually meant. Now, I already showed what that meant in context, that it was about restitution for damage that was done. But the Mishnah, it's like a commentary on the law to help explain people understand what they're supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do. They have questions just like we do. They had commentaries and studies and stuff. And so he says, if someone wounds his fellow, becomes liable to compensate the injured party for 5 different aspects of the injury. And those 5 aspects are damage, pain, healing, loss of time from work, and insult, which we've all seen. And so there's explanation there. What Jesus is saying is, so you've been taught this about the practice of restitution, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. What I want to teach is something beyond that. So he says, but I tell you, don't resist the evildoer. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him also the other. What is he talking about there? He's talking about forgiveness. When a person strikes you and causes you damage, causes you pain, they should pay restitution for what they've done. What I want you to do is forgive them. Yeshua is establishing a higher calling here. When we have offense, when we have problems with people where we are at a loss because of actions done towards us, where Yeshua wants us to excel is in the area of forgiveness. That's point number 1. Point number 2, and the one wanting to sue you and take your shirt, let him also have your coat. So the person who is now offended by you and wants to, get something out of you because they feel like you owe them, he wants you to give them extra. Give them more than what you owe. Give them more than what you owe. And then in verse 41, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. This is referring to a practice where Roman soldiers used to just look at just everyday citizens and say, hey, you, I need you to carry my stuff for me for the next mile. And that was like the requirement. You had to do that. And then you had to go back home. It was to help carry their burdens. What Yeshua was saying practically was go an extra mile. They asked you to go 1, you go 2. And so he's teaching them a new way, right? Not about restitution, not about retribution, about forgiveness, about grace, about mercy, and about love. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So there's mercy there, there's grace there, there's forgiveness, there's love, there's seeking a path in which you're not looking for restitution for every offense. He wants us to establish a different kind of way, different kind of community, a different kind of living. A more gracious and loving and merciful community is what he's asking for. Now, does that mean that you just always let people do whatever they want to do and so on and so forth? And there's more context for that. Matthew tells a parable about the man who, owed so much and owed so little, and who forgave and who didn't forgive, and how God wants us to forgive and to forgive. And he wants us to forgive abundantly. But also, Paul teaches the idea that vengeance does belong to God. So there will be retribution. There will be retribution, but that retribution will be doled out by God. For now, the retribution that we're looking at for sin against us is the cross. We look at Jesus' cross, Yeshua's cross, and we say, because of the cross, because of how I've been forgiven, I will forgive. And remember, his very own words on the cross mirrored this teaching. He didn't put us in a position where we couldn't do what he's asking us to do, or we couldn't do something that he wasn't willing to do. He did it as well. Father, forgive them. Did he call out injustice when it happened? Sure he did. When they accused him of many things and they slapped him in the face, he spoke up. He spoke up to the injustice that he was suffering. Injustice that's laid out for us in Exodus chapters 21 to 23. Injustice is not supposed to happen. He called them out for it, sure. But ultimately, he chose to suffer and obey the Father, endure the suffering, and to forgive those who caused him suffering. And that's where, again, he is setting a new path and a new standard for his community, how we're going to be a light for the nations. So our final passage in Matthew chapter 17, and this passage has everything to do with the festivals and the celebrating of festivals and Yeshua's position with God and with Moses. When Moses goes up to that high mountain, it tells us that when Moses spends all that time with God, eventually his face is going to shine. The people are going to ask him to put a veil over his face because they're afraid. They see him shining, like, oh, this is so weird. We see here Jesus goes up, and he's up at the top of the mountain. He transfigures. What we see here is Jesus goes up to that mountain. He's transfigured, and his face shines even brighter than the face of Moses at that time back in Exodus. And you see that Moses and Elijah are there, and Peter is seeing all this with James and John, and he says, oh, we should build 3 Sukkot for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. I've not too long ago heard someone say that, Peter was a bumbling, mumbling, stumbling dummy, and so when he said this, he's like, no, that's not at all what's happening. Peter wasn't a dummy. Peter was extremely intelligent. Peter knew the scriptures. Peter knew the fulfillment of scriptures. Peter knew that Sukkot is tied to the coming of the Messiah eventually. As time goes on, as it first happened, it's a remembrance of spending time with God in the desert. He's in their presence, as I mentioned earlier. As time moves forward and they go and they establish themselves in Israel and the land, and then they go into captivity, as for reasons we saw in Jeremiah because of their failures to keep the covenant. They then developed an idea, theology, and eschatology about the return of God to Zion, and the festival of Sukkot is the one that symbolizes that return, dwelling with God's presence in booths, in tents, in holy Jerusalem. It's straight up mentioned at the end of Zechariah that all the nations have to participate in that festival or face consequences in the next kingdom. And so that was their eschatology. And so Peter knew that. And so when Peter saw this thing happen, he wasn't bumbling, stumbling like an idiot. He was realizing what he was seeing, and he believed this is the fulfillment of that festival. This is the fulfillment of Sukkot. It's time now. God is going to dwell us. So should we build these booths for you and for Moses, for an Elijah, for us to dwell in and we can hang out? And because this is the kingdom of God, it's here, right? Because he's seeing this amazing thing happen. That's why he did that. Remember, in that moment, they met with God and they thought they can't come close, but then they did, and they saw his feet. And now they're seeing his face. And so they're like, wow, we get to sit down and we get to eat together. We get to have a meal. We get to worship and live with God as one. He thought this is the fulfillment of the kingdom. That's what he was thinking. It wasn't a stumbling, bumbling dummy. And while he's saying that, God interjects, says, this is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And just like the people back there in Exodus, they hear the voice of God. For them, there was trembling and everything else. We don't see that there's trembling, but they hear the voice of God. And just hearing that voice, they fall face down terrified because they realize, wow, who's actually here? Which is something they're also expecting. Okay? They're expecting him to be there, but the fact that he's now there, it's like, whoa, he's actually here now. And so they go down. And so it feels like the fulfillment of what they've been waiting for is here. And they're worshiping, terrified, the presence of God. But then Yeshua touches them and they get up and they see there's no one there. And that's where it's like, okay, so what did we just see? What did we just experience? Because we thought this was going to be the end. But what did the Father tell them to do? Listen to him. At this point, Yeshua's already told them that he's going to die. Remember, Peter rebukes him. That's just there in Matthew chapter 16. This is chapter 7. He says, that just happened according to Matthew's narrative. But they're not listening. They're not listening to what they're being told. They're not getting it. They're not recognizing the truth that their faith is wrong. It's not completely wrong. It's just off the mark. Earlier I started off the podcast talking about deconstruction and deconstructing faith. There's a lot of people doing that. I've been doing that. But it's really important that when you build it back up, that you build it back up based on the truth that we have. And where we got to start then is with studying the scripture and understanding what the scripture is saying, what the scripture is telling us, what the scripture means, and getting deep into it in that sense so that when we build up our faith, we're not off even by a little bit. Yeshua's warning to Peter about sinking in the water, why you have so little faith, was actually not about the size of his faith. It was about the accuracy of his faith. It's like, why aren't you getting it? Why aren't you getting it? Why I'm here? I'm here to die. All the disciples just really believed that he was going to establish the kingdom. In that moment, they thought it was going to happen. Peter thought, for sure this is going to happen. Let's build the Sukkot. Let's build the tabernacles. Let's build the booths. Let's do this thing. Because now is the moment. Now is the time. The kingdom of God is coming. And the voice of God has to tell them, listen to my son, because he's been telling you he's got to die first. He's got to be betrayed and handed over where he will be crucified, and then he will rise again. Even Judas's betrayal was based on the idea that Jesus is going to, they're going to come try to arrest him or whatever. Then the angels are going to come and the mountain's going to split and God's going to fight the battle. And so Yeshua's got nothing to worry about. So let me make a little money on the side. That's what he liked, right? Let me make a little money on the side. I'll get the money and then they'll be, punished by God and I won't have to pay them back, or I get to keep the money, whatever. Let me keep the money. God will deal with them. And then I've got an extra 30 pieces of silver. And it's not much. It's the worth of a slave, but I'm not really betraying him. I just want to make a little coin before all the big stuff happens. That passage with the slaves and setting them free. Later on, Moses tells the people, and it's through God, and it's in Deuteronomy. He's like, don't, and debts and everything else, like, don't withhold lending someone money knowing that the next year is the Sabbath year. Don't do that. Why? Because you're thinking in your head, I don't want to lend him money because then next year he doesn't have to pay me back. Everything gets set back to zero and he doesn't owe me anything. And so Moses taught them Deuteronomy, and God was teaching again through Moses, doing that kind of thing is evil. Knowing that next year you got to set them free and you got to pay out, let the debts go and all that kind of stuff. That's not what I'm trying to teach. I'm trying to teach, a different kind of community, so that even if next year you have to set them free and release their debts, that you're still going to let them borrow money and you still won't do it without interest. You're still giving back their pledge, because why? The most important thing is taking care of my neighbor, making sure they can survive the next night, the next day, the next winter, the next year. and however long it is. And I thought about that because I'm thinking about Judas, and it's like, wow, I'm gonna make a little bit of money because God's gonna do this. But then what happened? His faith was wrong. He was off the mark. He saw him get arrested, and he felt guilty, and he tried to get him back. He tried to undo it. He felt remorse, and then he ended up hanging himself because he couldn't undo it. And it's like, wait a minute, this is not happening the way I thought it would happen. And the people of Israel, what do you think happened there? Still wanted the money. They charged the interest. They disobeyed the basic tenets of the covenant, thereby creating a community God did not want to exist. And that's where you and I, beloved, as followers of Yeshua, that's where we have to focus our thoughts and minds and our hearts on what community are we a part of? What community did Yeshua intend to build? What faith did he define and author? All of those things matter, because you can find yourself with the right faith but in the wrong community. You can find yourself with the wrong faith and in the right community. There's a lot of different ways that can work. Ultimately, the goal should be the right faith in the right community, and that good relationship with people, with our neighbor, and with God. All right, thank you again for watching. I pray God's blessing on all of you who would listen and study the scriptures, and just look forward to next time.